and turn over the session to Dr. Margrit Betke, who is a professor at computer science here at Boston University, where she co-leads the AI Research Initiative and the Image and Video Computing Research Group. Margrit conducts research in medical image analysis, computer vision, human-computer interaction, and applications of machine learning. Margrit, please take it away.
Right, thanks, Ishad. Yeah, so I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, Maja Matarić. She's the Chan Soon Xiong Distinguished Professor of Computer Science, Neuroscience, and Pediatrics at the University of Southern California. And she's also the founding director of the Robotics and Autonomous Systems Center at USC. She got her PhD and MS from MIT, and that's where we actually overlapped. And we met almost like 30 years ago or so. And since then, you know, I've followed Maja's career. It's just amazing what she has achieved and what she's been doing. So she's been a leader at her university as a research leader, a vice president for research, for example. She's done a lot of work also in all kinds of organizations, IEEE, ACM, and so forth. And what's most exciting is that she's the pioneer of the field of socially assistive robotics. So she's like a leader in kind of creating this whole field. And I'm so excited that she's gonna tell us about it. How, you know, robots can be helpful in rehabilitation of people and helping them after people had strokes or have dementia. So it's such an important area, and I'm so thankful that you're here and very excited to hear your talk.
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, that it has been such a pleasure to listen to the talks so far. I don't always say that about the sessions I'm in. So I just really want to say these have been wonderful talks and wonderful speakers. And I hope the last speaker does give his contact information like he said he would, because I'm looking for that. So it's just been a wonderful, wonderful workshop to be a part of. All right, I'm gonna go to my slides now. My slides also have audio, but it doesn't matter if it doesn't work. We'll get through it. I can narrate. I am loud and vocal, so it'll be okay. It'll have to do, because I know it's been hard enough. So we'll just give it a shot and try. All right, let's see. Oh, see, it doesn't give me the option to share sound, FYI. So let's see. I don't know why that is.
Do you see at the top left part of the screen something that says original sound, and you can turn it on for you, and it removes the noise suppression?
So the screen, the whole Zoom screen, I'm seeing only recording. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe is it the meeting
right, next to the recording. No. Next to recording on the right, I have something called. Okay.
Nope. No. So it's okay. I don't want to delay us, because I don't think it's going to be that important. I'll just talk over it. It's okay. All right. But it's important that everyone can see the slides, right? So can you just somebody say yes?
Yes, we can see the slides. Yes.
Excellent. Okay. And now let me get rid of, okay, we're all there. Okay. So I'm actually going to talk about personalizing assistive technologies. So it may not be exactly as expected, but you know, we'll see. It complements what we have talked about so far. And I want to start by possibly not the most, well, I think this is the most important message, right? So the question is, what is the message to the audience? And I want to start with the most important message, but it may not be the most pleasant one. And I'm just going to wrap it up by saying, do we know what we're doing when we're trying to create assistive technologies? And I would argue that most people don't. And I think it's because, and I discovered this myself. Recently, we got a really exciting grant from NSF, an accelerator from the disability track. And one of the first things that they hit us over the head with was talking to a lot of people. And I've done this stuff for over 20 years, and I thought I knew it. But really, the only way to understand what is needed is for everybody on the team, everybody, to talk and especially to listen in person. It can be over Zoom, but it has to be in person. It cannot be via email. It cannot be via some form, and in detail to many members of the user community that you're trying to impact. And I think this is lost on 99% of technology development. And it's lost because it's super inefficient, but we have to do it. We cannot just do science as usual. We can't just read papers. We cannot give surveys to people and just do some analysis and decide that, oh, look, 80% of people say this. And we cannot delegate it to graduate students. We cannot delegate it to anyone. We have to do it, because understanding lived experience that isn't our own is extremely slow and inefficient, but it is absolutely necessary. And if we're not convinced of this, then we can look at the evidence. History is riddled with extremely bad examples of products and technologies in every space, including the assistive space. And even though the assistive space is so underattended, right? It's unfortunate that most people don't work in it. If we are going to work in it, then we have to do it right. Because the burden it's high, but it's the right way to respect what we're doing. So I know I sound like a mom when I'm saying this, but I'm just going to tell you, if you don't do this, you will fail. So we learned some wonderful things in our experience on the grant that we're pursuing now. And I should say, to not distract you there, the grant that we're working on is attempting to work with a completely broad variety of users with physical disabilities to enable them to basically learn to program, which means enter code into what's ultimately a document through something that would usually be a keyboard and a mouse. But what if they can't use that? It seems like such an obvious thing. It's not an obvious thing, and it isn't limited to a specific subgroup, which is what everyone keeps asking. They're like, which disability are you working with? And then you go and you talk to people from the community, and they say things like, that's an irrelevant question. And so I just want to give you a few insights of what we heard that were particularly important, I think, to everybody working in assistive things. So here's a good one that gets to policy. We don't need curbs, we need jobs. And I think this gets at the heart of a lot of people are extremely well-meaning. All of us are well-meaning, but we think we know what people need. So as an example, a whole lot of money went into curbs and ramps and stuff, but not into jobs. What really changes people's lives? Is it really the ramps, or is it the ability to get a job? And you can argue that ramps will eventually get them a job, but that's a really long path. It's a little too indirect. Another key point is we just want to be seen and respected for who we are. So not lumped into a quote population, not averaged over. And then a point that has been brought up by multiple speakers today is that we do not want to be fixed or improved to be like everyone else. And this is exactly like the point that was just made by the previous speaker, which isn't even philosophical. It's a human rights point, which is that everyone is exactly as they are and they don't need to be fixed. And we see this today because the rates of anxiety and depression and autism are so huge. And now we're starting to think about, what does typical mean? What does quote average mean? What does it mean to fix? And a lot of the populations will tell you, we don't want to be fixed. We don't need to be fixed. So that's a very interesting thing. And so the main point is we're all different and unique. And so don't assume that one approach fits all or even most. And this idea of kind of averaging people, of trying to come up with, standard solutions just doesn't work. I mean, if you think about it realistically, the QWERTY keyboard that we all use, it's terrible. It's kind of a random accident of history. It's not great for anybody, but we make do unless we can't. But that's not a good thing, right? And see, I think the point from the previous talk about how assistive technologies really drive technology, that's a very, very good point. So we cannot rely on our intuition. We cannot rely on our best intentions. Everyone in this workshop has best intentions. Let's just take that as a given. It's not enough. We have to co-design. We cannot do anything fast. We cannot afford to break things. That whole model is just not good. We cannot do skipping of testing. I would say all of this is hubris. That's why I have Icarus up there in the upper right-hand corner. You want to get to the sun a little too fast. So annoying as it is, this process has to be slow, inefficient, and highly collaborative. But that's the only way we'll do something meaningful. So that's kind of like, I'm going to turn off my rant and tell you cool things, but I wanted to get that across. The other point that's very important is that solutions should empower autonomy and not remove it. And I don't think that's about assistive. I think that's just about the world, right? We're looking at a massive leaps in AI. I mean, let's talk about large language models. People are very worried about what does this mean about replacement. And so when we think about technologies in general, I've been arguing for quite a few years now, we should be thinking more about augmentation and enhancement rather than automation and replacement. And assistive technologies by definition are meant to augment, but they don't always, right? So we should keep that in mind. They're meant to augment, not replace, because the human ability to work gives us purpose. And when we don't have that, for whatever reason, a lot of bad things happen. So I did have a wonderful opportunity to pioneer with others the field of socially assistive robotics. And it is very much trying to address this need about how do we help people help themselves, but specifically through social, not physical interaction. Now, I will talk in great detail about why that's important and give you many examples, but ultimately it's about empowering people where they are to do what they would like to be able to do. So that's very important because we really focus in on human motivation, because as you will see, that's kind of where everything happens or doesn't happen. There are a lot of technologies for monitoring people. There are a lot of technologies for coaching and training, but we can all tell that those are not enough. So you can have the quantified self. We can have a lot of data about an individual, but data are not the same as behavior change. And similarly, there are a lot of coaching apps out there. There are, for example, a bazillion of them right now for anxiety, and yet we have an epidemic of anxiety, much bigger epidemic of anxiety than COVID. And COVID is bad enough, and it made it worse. And so we don't have great tools yet. But I think one place that's very worth looking at is that nexus of motivation and human or socially assistive companionship and social support. So let's go into some details. Let me give you a little bit of history of this field, which I am extremely fond of. Of course, I'm biased. So it kind of arose in the early 2000s. So we're celebrating about 2 decades now. Yes, I feel very old. And it started with short-term deployments. And in my slides here, you can see images from this. These are from our lab. Of course, there's a lot more work. You could just Google it. It's a whole field. So there's plenty of work in it, and that there's nothing more thrilling than to see it grow. But the important thing is that when the field started, people were doing mostly in lab studies and maybe very short term, go stop by the clinic and collect, like talk to somebody for an hour. And then a decade later, those who were brave were getting into short-term studies, midterm deployments, like staying at a school. I remember we were staying at a public school for 2 weeks. We were taking the robot to the retirement home repeatedly. And here we are now. Now we're at a place where we have, for example, deployed a robot in many homes of kids with autism for over a month at a time and collected unprecedented amounts of data. Alzheimer's, we have had a robot in a nursing home, a memory care unit for 6 months. So really, this is necessary because only those real world deployments tell us what people really need and what they use and what happens beyond just the novelty effect. So I'm always challenging people to get out of the lab and go out in the real world in order to create these technologies for empowerment. So now I want to get a little computational just to, because it is an AI workshop, and tell you, so what do we really do? So again, our goal is to help people help themselves. And that is really about generating and sustaining motivation to do these things that are really difficult. So adherence, how do you stick with things that you need to do, but they're really, really hard? Whether it's rehab, whether it's trying to identify some assistive device, which is really not made for you and it doesn't really help you sufficiently. And then have grit, which is push through failure. And how do we do this? So we do modeling at various levels, right? Computational modeling. Usually we are modeling some kind of a behavioral phenomenon. I'll talk about a few. We always model the user because, as I will keep repeating, every user is different and every user changes over time. And so there is no fixed policy that will work great over a long period of time for any user. So we have to model and personalize to the user. And most technologies don't. And so no wonder most technologies are not great yet. So here's a fundamental underlying thing, right? I talked about motivation. So engaging the user in doing something, giving them the motivation to do it is really important. You can design a wonderful device that empowers someone, but in the end, life is still hard and getting things done is still hard. And so how do you motivate them to want to use it? just don't assume that, you know, the engagement comes for free. It doesn't. I mean, user engagement is something that the entertainment world is constantly worried about, right? How do we engage people? How do we keep them streaming, right? But we're looking at it from a much more challenging perspective, which is how do we get someone to keep doing something that is good for them, but it's hard, as opposed to the opposite, which is not good for them, but easy, like, you know, binge watching. So how the challenge is, how do we determine if the user is engaged, establish that engagement, and then maintain it? And these have to be concurrent, ongoing, continual processes all the time. And engagement is really complex. It's contextual, and it depends on interaction dynamics. So everything, eye gaze, head direction, facial expressions, body pose and movement, vocalizations, language, and these vary depending on the context and the abilities of the individual who's interacting. And then to make it even harder, it is very individual. So in a very obvious way, you can imagine there are cultural differences, let's say, to body language, or there are subpopulation differences in, let's say, autism, ADHD, anxiety, in things like eye gaze and activity level and even tone of voice. And then, of course, there are individual differences. So this is why we have to look at really a lot of data or a lot of data from an individual so that we can adapt. So let me give you lots of examples from our work, but I should really say it's work of my students. It's not my work. I'm just so honored to work with these amazing people. So one area we were very interested in is early development. A lot of people work on a lot of things. Very few people work with babies because babies are hard. You know, they keep changing. Everything is really critical. If you don't catch it, they can fall behind in early development because it's so wired. And you know, they can't tell you what's going on, and you can't tell them what to do. So they're a complicated population, but they're just so darn cute. But the other thing about babies that's incredibly motivating in terms of doing work in early development is that if you can help an infant early on, the difference is huge lifelong, right? So it's like if you think of it as a vector and you move it just a little bit, it makes a huge difference lifelong. So we found this motivating. So we started out by looking at kids who have babies, infants, 3 to 9 month olds who have, but especially 3 to 6 month olds who have delays in their motor abilities. So if you have some kind of a delay in motor development, what happens is if it doesn't get addressed early on, it could be a permanent disability that could be just learned. It has not been, like, the development has not happened quickly enough. And so I want to play you a video to illustrate that. Even if there will be no audio, I'm going to guess. You can't hear that, right? I'm guessing not, but that's okay. What's happening is if an infant has delay in movement, we want to motivate them to do a desired kind of movement. But how do you get a kid to do a specific thing? Parents know this can't be done, especially with infants. Non-parents are, well, optimistic, but let me tell you can't do it. So how do I get the baby to kick his right leg, which is the one that he has a delay with? Well, not in this particular video, but that's an example. How'd you do it? So we use the robot as a motivational tool because the robot is visually salient and it triggers the imitation, the mirror neurons for the kid. And it's interesting because it does it very uniquely in the sense that if you, as an adult, try to get the baby to imitate, they may imitate your facial expressions, but they won't imitate your body. There's a scaling issue there. And you can't teach another baby to coach your baby. That's out of range. So how do we do this? How do we get babies to do physical exercises? And so my extremely brave student, Lauren Klein, who will be on the academic job market in a year, did beautiful work. And this is just one piece of her dissertation where she was interested in modeling surprise, visual salience for babies and saying, okay, babies tend to imitate what they see. So if we could draw their attention to a specific target, if we can puppeteer their perception, we could puppeteer their action. And so she looked at models of surprise. Laurent Iti and Pierre Baldi had a model that was based on adult data going back all the way to NeurIPS 06. And Lauren bravely tried it on babies. And lo and behold, it is very predictive of baby gaze as well, because early vision, after all, is one of rare things that is consistent across infants and adults. There are not many things that are consistent, but that's one. And so she was able to basically drive, if you think about it just at a very high level, she was able to use a model of visual salience and surprise to say, I can predict where I should move to surprise you. So I will move there and draw your attention and thereby trigger your imitation. And so basically it's like puppeteering a baby. And because a robot is doing it, it is consistently drawing their attention. And so you're able to actually drive the baby's behavior and get them to exercise the things that they need to exercise in order to do rehab. Because in rehab, if you don't move, and you in physical rehab, if you don't have basically the neural activation to move, if someone else moves your arm, you're not learning and you're not getting the gains. You have to want to. And so you have to stimulate the want, and then there has to be enough positive feedback. Physically, there has to be observed feedback so as to get a reward, right? So this is what's happening here, right? There's basically stimulating the movement, and then the kid gets the reward. And that's why you saw the little red ball in the video, because also kicking the ball gives them additional reward. So it's just a piece of beautiful work on Lauren's part of connecting computational models with physical action and perception to help infants. And then she moved on, of course, and started to look in more detail at modeling dyadic interactions. So what can we understand about the give and take between two partners, the infant and someone else? It could be a robot, and that's really predictable and wonderful, or it could be a parent where it's much more real, but it's not as predictable. And sometimes not even so wonderful, because unfortunately, many parents are suffering toxic stress. And we now know that just if a parent is suffering toxic stress, their physical behavior patterns and their eye gaze will be atypical, and the babies pick up on that very quickly. And that creates atypical behavior and atypical delayed development. So these are really serious cascades that can result in lifelong disability or difference. And so Lauren's work is focused on modeling these dyadic interactions. What is typical for the specific dyad? Because there's no such thing as typical. Again, this idea that there's the normal, and then we're looking for something that is, quote, outside of the normal. Well, there is no normal in infant development. There's just some stages that are very roughly assigned. But if you really talk to any developmental scientist, they'll tell you that we don't have quantitative models of what is normal for a given child at a given time. It's very personal, it's very contextual. So it's wonderful. It can be very computational if you have enough data, real data from real people and real interactions. And that's where, brave students should go and study. Because again, with babies, if you do something early on, you can literally change their trajectory for life. All right, that's one. Now let me totally switch gears. One thing that we know about recovery, about managing challenging conditions, is empathy and compassion, both towards others and towards the self, are highly therapeutic, but rarely practiced. So we were interested in seeing whether we can create robots that will make people be more empathetic. Now that's interesting because it's not what most people do. Most people are interested in making robots act like they're empathetic. Sure, you can make a robot that looks like it's empathetic. Of course, it isn't really, because it doesn't know what it means to, quote, feel empathy. But if you read Simon Baron-Cohen, he will tell you, I believe correctly, that empathy is about what you do, not about what you feel. Because we have no access to what people feel. But if you behave in an empathetic way, that is what affects both your brain and the recipient's life and brain. And so can we get robots that will make people be empathetic? And so we explored the space of what should the robots say and do to elicit empathy in people? And we looked at storytelling in the first and third person about robots, about people. I can reassure you that people all feel more empathetic to stories about humans and not robots. So we're still human. We also looked at robots asking for help and seeing what kinds of things will elicit empathy. But most importantly, we did this so that we can develop computational models of what behaviors elicit empathy. And this is important because if we can get machines to get people to behave more empathetically to others and to themselves, this could be therapeutic. So this is just the beginning, but again, empathy, compassion, areas we can actually model. Another thing related to empathy and support is support groups. So a lot of work that my lab has done over the 20 years is one-on-one human-machine interaction, supportive, assistive human-machine interaction. But then I had brave students who wanted to work on multi-party interactions, because a lot of our lives pre-pandemic, involved multiple people being in the same place, doing something, solving problems. So how can we get them to be supportive? And we started with just groups of people solving problems. That was work of Elaine Short. She's now at Tufts University. But more recently, my student Chris Birmingham has been working on support groups. And COVID actually created a larger need for virtual support groups. So people couldn't get together in person, or not as easily, but they could get together on Zoom. And there are a lot of things from dealing with surviving and dealing with cancer to anxiety, depression, and everything else. So support groups. So how can we create supportive agents in these groups that could actually elicit disclosure and get people to increase their trust? Because if that happens, there are actually positive health effects that are observed when people attend support groups. They engage in disclosure and trust. So how can we create that? And of course, in a private and safe way. And the first thing you have to do is you have to look at kind of turn taking, because if an agent interrupts someone, that does the opposite of creating trust and increasing disclosure, right? Makes sense. So how do we do that? And so we were looking at state of the art, and it turns out most of this was done purely with speech. So my student did the obvious yet highly effective thing of using eye gaze direction and head pose, and ended up winning a competition on turn taking, just by doing multimodal work. Now, one, he deserves kudos, he's smart, but two, why is the field still stuck on unimodal signals, right? We as human beings are very complex. We use any modality we have access to communicate. And so should our machines. They should be picking up all of these signals that we're doing. In another piece of really, really painfully difficult work, and I credit a whole bunch of students who worked on this. We were working with students who were homebound. This was before the pandemic, who were homebound due to, it was a variety of reasons. Some were behavioral, some were emotional, and some were physical. So we had students who had ALS-like conditions and could barely move one finger to control a keyboard, all the way to students who were physically able-bodied but had extreme social anxiety. So there's a broad variety of needs, and I really want to emphasize that. I think it's important to think about this broad variety of needs rather than saying, I'm going to help specifically this one group. So yes, we were able to give a remote presence robot access, for example, to a student who had not been in a classroom for 5 years because of his ALS. And this was the first time he was in the classroom. And he loved this remote presence robot because, this remote presence robot that basically just has a simple base and that's all it can do, it could do physically more than he could. And so for him, it was like opening up the world. I mean, literally, we were all crying. It was amazing. At the same time, a student who had extreme social anxiety found the robot extremely frustrating as well, because, you had to move the whole robot around just to turn your head, because they were used to having the full physical ability, but they were worried about things like, well, I'm talking too loudly because the robot doesn't modulate my voice appropriately in a social setting based on all of the background. For example, if the background noise is high, it amplifies my voice, but I don't want to stand out, right? Because of social anxiety. So the point is, these needs are very broad, but they need to be taken into account, and you can't cancel one from the other. Because after all, if someone has physical challenges, they also don't want to stick out socially. So these things are very complex. And so we collected a huge data set, and then I don't even think we've analyzed it yet. And it's been 2 years because it's just really hard. But this is what needs to be done. So we have to look at real people in real settings and collect real data. So in here, we were really interested in what kinds of modalities were really telling of the outcomes we're looking for. Again, very multimodal, very immersive. One of our biggest studies where we're still analyzing the data and happily still publishing was that deployment I mentioned, where we put, it was about 20 robots in 20 different homes in LA, and not in a wealthy area. So not in an area where we had the convenience of amazing Wi-Fi and always air conditioning, et cetera. So we were looking at a kind of a downtown area, which downtown in LA is not the business district. And so we were deploying to families with kids with autism, one or more, because there's a genetic component. So often you get multiple siblings who are on the spectrum. And so we were interested in seeing how we could deploy a socially assistive robot in the home in order to serve as a companion to teach this combination of skills that many kids on the spectrum are missing, which is the cognitive and the social and the emotional, because you can't really separate it. When kids go to school and interact with peers, they're learning all of that. And when they don't, as we saw in 2020, serious things happen, right? The kids who were not in school for good reason are now having to catch up on their social and emotional skills, if not on cognitive ones as well. So, and kids on the spectrum often don't get that exposure because they don't have playmates, because their behavior is considered, quote, atypical. So let's look at a short video. Okay, you won't get the audio, but anyway. And this is on the web.
Adrian, age 6.
So Adrian is 6. And this is the robot.
Friend.
And the robot, his name is Kiwi, and it says, hey, you're doing a great job.
They've settled in to play some games.
And they're playing some games along with his brother.
The autism spectrum. And Kiwi is no toy.
And Kiwi's not a toy. Kiwi's a socially assistive robot. And
actually, the audio is coming through.
Good work. Pardon? Oh, did someone say something?
The audio is coming through.
Oh, it is coming through. Oh my God. So I'm talking over it.
Magically.
Okay. Oh my gosh. I wish I'd known that. Okay. All right. Let me, do you guys mind if I play this without talking? Because you probably would prefer that.
Meet Adrian, age 6.
This is some great work.
And his robot friend, Kiwi.
You're doing an amazing job.
On this weekend morning, they've settled in to play some games, along with Big Brother Darren. Adrian is on the autism spectrum, and Kiwi is no toy. It's a socially assistive robot.
Okay, that video is on the web. I encourage people who are interested to see it. You could just look for socially assistive robotics, Science Nation. So the National Science Foundation kindly came and recorded, and what they recorded, it was really important because they recorded a lot of students working on this and really showing the full diversity of human effort that it takes. But this was a wonderful challenge because, you know, one thing that people say about autism correctly is once you've met one person with autism, you have met exactly one person with autism, because it is defined as a spectrum of symptoms and symptom severities. And so it's really I think the extreme case of a challenge. And if we can make things work for autism, we can do a lot of things. And this is to the point of the previous speaker as well. Assistive technologies should drive technology. So you need complete personalization. So how would you have this system which helps a child do a cognitive task, but gives the social signals that are needed and also the emotional support? Now, why does it need to be a robot and not the family? Because the family can't be there 24/7. Again, remember the pandemic? People still had to work, even if from their computers, if they had that luxury, and you know, go to the bathroom and eat and sleep. And so somebody has to be there 24/7 often. So how could you develop this personalized social, emotional, and cognitive tutor? And of course, it's a tall order, but in our case, the key point was that he could help with these simple social signals like eye gaze, for example. If the robot is talking, the child should look at the robot. If the child doesn't do that, the robot will be disappointed and communicate this, just in a way that a helpful peer would. Now, many peers are not helpful, unfortunately, because they're young and don't know better, and also because, well, people could be better people. But the robot is endlessly patient and very helpful, right? And so then the question is, how do we generalize from the interactions with the robot to the interaction with other kids and other people? And this is the same question as how do we generalize from therapy sessions to the real world? These are not therapy sessions, right? But it's the same thing with autism therapy, same thing with anxiety therapy. How do you generalize from a controlled setting? And one of the things that this system does is it does also triadic multi-party interactions where, you know, it can bring in the sibling or the parent. And so you're now generalizing the interaction. But what does it take? It takes a lot. Clearly, we needed some models to understand even the behavior of the child, right? Is the child paying attention? I will get to that in the next slide, but let's focus here on even the cognitive part, right? So there are, we know about, of course, the entire field of kind of intelligent tutoring systems. But the issue with those systems is they don't do any kind of emotional or social support. And really what you need is not just elevating the challenge level, but also understanding the level of feedback that's provided, right? Because if the child is failing consistently, you don't just give them an easier problem or give them negative feedback. You need to do some appropriate combination of, you know, better steps that are presented, but also better feedback. And for some kids, depending on their disposition, right, challenging them might be effective, or it might be demoralizing. So this is very important, right? Knowing the disposition of the child. I'm not saying personality, because that's a different notion in children than it is in adults. So we were looking at modeling both the challenge level and the level of feedback. This is all within a reinforcement learning context, because reinforcement learning ultimately is the best way to adapt to a user through a repeated interaction. And indeed, you see people using reinforcement learning to train large language models, because in the end, it's never going to be just one kind of learning. So as always, we're interested in multimodal data. So you have multimodal data from kids who are interacting with this robot. How can you even tell if they're engaged? Turns out engagement, right? That problem that I said to you from the beginning is very complex. In autism, for example, if a child is looking straight ahead, that doesn't mean that they're paying attention. They might be tuned out. Actually, that's true for everybody. In autism, however, you might find the child looking away and back through the corner of their eye, which is not salient to the vision system. And it might look like the child is not paying attention, but in fact they are. This is how they engaged. So how do you develop these very, very diverse models? And so with really significant means and variances across participants and sessions and engagement states. And so we have done quite a bit of modeling on this, looking at early fusion models of all the modalities that work, again, multimodality being shown as a major pathway forward. Another thing that we looked at, it was, can you do transfer learning from other kids on the spectrum to an individual on the spectrum? It's very complex, right? Because there's so much variance. And so we did the first validated model of arousal and valence, which are the dimensions of emotion usually used in research, with kids with autism. And basically we're able to show that we can use supervised domain adaptation, so that these personalized models could trade off this very small amount of data that you usually have about the user themselves versus the more data that you might have from other users, even if those data are high variance, as it is the case in autism. Because really, most of the discussion today in AI is a big data discussion. But that's I'm just going to say, that's not going to apply. Not only is it not going to apply to disability, it's ultimately not going to apply in general, because looking at helping each individual is a small n problem. It's a small data problem. So how do you work in the small data, high variance data regime? That's the really hard problem. Now, maybe you have a large data set that you can use. Maybe there's transfer, maybe not. Even if there is transfer, what is really effectively transferring, right? So these are really interesting hard problems. And there's a lot of great work to be done. So I hope people will jump in. The previous speaker mentioned augmented reality. We're all interested in augmented reality. I'm interested in augmented reality for augmented ability. So I don't want to put people in headsets and have them not interact with one another, but I would love light glasses, a la Google Glass, how many years ago, but something very light that doesn't impede normal human interaction, but gives additional information to the user. Whatever it may be. It may be eye gaze for individuals on the spectrum. It may be social interaction for those with social anxiety. Who knows? It might be some information that's cognitively facilitating to the user. There's just so much that could be done. So we're just, the examples you're seeing here are things like allowing people to understand the robot better. That's kind of a theory of mind question. Then on the other side, you see actually real-time programming. It's kinesthetic. So kids are moving while they're physically moving blocks in space to program. And it turns out this is very enabling for those who can do so physically, because they retain better, they experiment more. And obviously it's known in learning that if you experiment, you learn more and retain better. And the physical interaction allows them to actually return and explore more and learn better, retain better. So the question is, how can we do this though for people with a variety of physical abilities? All right, so I'm just gonna wrap up here and say, we need a lot more work on multimodal long-term personalization. So when we think about developing these assistive devices, I think 99% of the time people are thinking in a kind of a business model way. I get that. I did a startup, but you're forced into a particular mindset. Find a solution that's going to work for as many people as possible. Ideally, the giant entire consumer market. But in fact, you need to look at personalized user models that can change over time. And that has serious implications for interfaces and combinations of interfaces and flexibility. Because again, every user is different and every user changes over time. I cannot overemphasize that. And so we have to do modeling and development for this social dynamic that is the interaction between the user and the technology, the user, like the assistive agents, right? This is all the era of developing assistive agents. But what will these things do? Will they really be personalized? Will they really know enough? And how can they know enough and still be private? But this is what we need to worry about, because we need this dynamic to be mutually and continually shaped, not fixed, like, here's your device, good luck. Well, I just want to show you a video. This is a 3-year-old child with cognitive disabilities interacting with the robot in real time. And this was 4 years before the pandemic. So I just want to show you this.
One, two.
So look at the eye gaze. There's an eye gaze. The child has to do the right thing, make the social contact with eye gaze, say the right thing, and then the robot will give her a reward. Okay, so it goes on. So I just want to say, why didn't we have this in the pandemic when all of those children were at home trying to learn things while their parents were desperately trying to survive as well? But there's a lot of technology that's available already, but it doesn't get out because of business model issues. So we have this duality of people trying to do canned one-size-fits-all solutions, which will not work. And also even those solutions not being supported, much less the ones that can actually be personalized. So I'm encouraged when I see workshops like this, because we can hopefully develop what is needed. The kinds of things we're working now, we're really leaning into mental health. So looking at a really low-cost robot so that we can do large-scale studies. And we're deploying, actually my students just this week started to deploy in the dorms to look at coping strategies for ADHD, anxiety, self-regulation. And yes, we are using language models, but very cautiously, because you never know what those things are going to say. You really don't. No one does. So not yet. And then we're looking at haptics, because physical touch is very, very effective at self-regulation if done appropriately. But who's touching what, when, how, quite complex. So I'm collaborating with my colleagues who are experts in this area. So to sum up, human-machine interaction can be empowering. There's some great results in the field: improved health outcomes, more reciprocal social engagement, more empathy, less selfishness, improved learning, so much that can be done. But only if we take time to listen and learn from the people that we say we're trying to help. And we create personalized methods. And only if we work with real world data and not the stuff that you can just download off the web for convenience. And so my last caveat, please get out there, talk to people. For everyone who doesn't know what to work on, you just go talk to someone who has a challenge in their life. I mean, we all have challenges, right? But just talk to a real person, talk to a few real people, and amazing research challenges will pop out right at you. I mean, that's how we form this whole field, because we just talk to people. Don't delegate, don't just read papers, go talk to people. Because it really that's been my experience. And I also, hear a lot from my students and from their lived experiences. And it's just the most satisfying thing in the world is to find something where you can make a tiny little bit of difference. That's how you get a foothold. So with that, I just thank my students. This is a photo when we could all be together safely. Many of these folks are now graduating, 4 of them this year. Yay! Thank you. And I'll take questions.
Yeah, Maja, thank you so much. This was very, very exciting work, and enjoyed the talk very much. I want to invite people who are attending to write their question in the Q&A box there with Zoom. And while we may be collecting some, maybe I can start us off a little bit. So I was really fascinated by the work that you presented on having a user become empathetic by interacting with the robot, or become more sort of trusting. And I was wondering, how do you measure that? Is that sort of done by the robot itself, or do you have a setup where you actually view the interaction, and or do you survey people? I mean, what's the way of measuring that?
You know, it's all of those things. So I generally, and I don't want to offend anyone, but I'm a big skeptic about surveys, because I think we know that we humans are not great at self-reflection. And so we use surveys, right? Because there are good validated surveys for trust and for other kinds of things, right? So we do pre-post surveys, but I'm always happier if I can do a functional measure. So then it's all about deciding, like, what's a functional measure of trust? Right. So we can talk about what would be a proxy for trust. Well, is it more eye gaze? Is it that, you know, people say more things? Do they have more of a one-on-one back and forth? Right. So that's why having these large data sets, or real world data sets, I don't want to say large, they're not large, but like, you know, if you collect from like 10 different groups, that's large already. So you look at these data and you really are looking for things that might be indicative. So I think this is one of these things that also people get obsessed with proper experiment design and hypothesis testing. And I'm just going to say it, this stuff is so new and it's so complex, and people are so complex, that the idea that we know ahead of time exactly what the dynamics will bring about, I think that's that's all kind of in the hubris zone, right? So I think we analyze the data and we look for things that are interesting, that come out ideally significant, you know, with some power. And then we go and then we say, okay, now this is something where we can test a hypothesis, right? And then you go and do the hypothesis. So often we don't know what's going to emerge. I don't know what's a good proxy for trust for that particular interaction. So that's the other thing I want to say, is that these things are always contextual, right? So I don't really believe that you can have the absolute proxy for trust in general, because it depends, right? Trust on the playground is different from trust in a, you know, in a support group for cancer, right? Which is different from like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? So I don't think there's going to be one measure. That's why it's good to take a lot of multimodal data and analyze it and see what we find. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. This is a great answer. All right, so we've gotten a question in. This is actually something I think you kind of already mentioned at the end of the talk. So here the attendee wants to know, how does a young student get started in this work? So maybe you can expand a little bit on, yes, talk to the users and come up with a problem. Maybe this attendee needs a little bit more here.
Yeah. So, I mean, all things, right? Because you presumably want to look for someone, you know, some lab in which you can do this. I don't know what young student means, right? Because I talk a lot to high school students, right? And they're so enamored with, I think, uninteresting problems or non-problems, because, you know, they can download some data set off the web and woo. And, you know, I just say, no, get out of your house, go into your neighborhood, find someone who has an actual need and try and help them. And you'll see how hard that is. And you'll learn a lot. And then even the tiniest thing that you do will be more meaningful, right? Because you'll learn something about a real world problem. So I often talk to very young students who don't have the luxury to get into a research lab. They always think, oh, if I could only be in your lab, I will do wonders. And I think, well, you know, you're 14. So you should maybe just go help someone and you'll learn a lot. And often students that I talk to, because of their own lived experience, the challenges that they've had, or maybe a family member had, or a sibling, that ends up teaching them a lot. And so that's very helpful. So, but if you're at a university,
he's actually, or he or she is at a high school.
Oh, okay. So if you're at a high school, okay, many things to do there, right? So volunteer, right? Because that's the best way to learn. And talk to a real person and try to develop something. If you can get your foot into the door at a university, like I developed a program at USC for high school students to actually come in and be in researcher labs. But that's only because I found enough faculty, my colleagues, and then their graduate students who would actually oversee the high schoolers. It's really hard when you're that young, you don't have enough expertise, but how do you get the expertise? Go talk to people, go hack on your own. You can learn a lot of things online. I have a high schooler right now who's volunteering in my lab, but she said, hey, I went off, I learned to program in Python, and I talked to all of these kids with autism, and I'm really motivated, and here are these reasons, and can I do anything at all? And I was like, okay, you know what? We'll give you some data to analyze. And she's really happy. And then she's like, oh, I can use this in my high school as a project. And then she's learning, and we're getting a little bit. But the point is, she did something to start with. I think in general, my big lesson to everybody would be, I think Kennedy said this, right? Ask not what somebody can do for you, right? Don't go to a lab and say, hey, I want to work in your lab because I want to learn about X. No, instead say, I'm really passionate about helping in this context. And here's what I've tried to learn. What else would you recommend that I learn so that I can be helpful? How can I help you? I will never forget a particular student who just waited in this long line of people who were talking to me very kindly. And then she just came up and said, I'm on the autism, and couldn't make eye contact, and said, I'm on the autism spectrum. I'll do anything to be in your lab. Now that is, when someone says that, wow, I mean, you can't say no, which is very different from folks who say, I want to come into your lab so I can do this thing. It's like, that's nice. I got things going on, right? So offer to help. Offering to help will open many doors because a lot of people need help, and you'll learn a lot. So that's my advice.
All right. I have another question for you. So I completely agree with you that personalization is really important. And at the beginning of the talk, you were going into the history sort of how data sets were first in the lab, just a few minutes, and then maybe a week, and now we're doing things for a month. So there's been a development there. And I wonder if we're going to have that sort of development with AI systems too. So it seems that a lot of people sort of still work with this model. Oh, there's some data set. Yeah, you can download it from the web, or maybe you can actually collect it yourself. And then you design the AI system, and then you test the system, and that's it. But when you have an opportunity to work with users and to have a robot interaction or an AI system interaction with the users, wouldn't it be better if the AI system could adapt during that interaction and learn how to learn and make the interaction personal, right? And so how far are we as a community? I feel that a lot of what people still do is have these canned data sets that you can, benchmarks, right, that you can run your computer vision algorithm against. And
Yep.
It's so much harder to do this sort of online adapting and working with users.
I agree with you completely. I think that what happens is it's hard enough to get a data set, right? So if you do collect it yourself, boy, you use it forever, right? And usually try to not even collect it yourself. And I think also it's a complex thing. Like, for example, look at what's happening now. I just want to make a parallel to the large language models, which, everyone's talking about, oh my God, it's going to change the world. Maybe not the best ways. So these are giant models, and they're not evolving, because that's the whole point. They're so massive that you can't keep evolving them. Okay, you can tune them, but how that's to your point, the world keeps changing, experiences keep getting developed, knowledge keeps being generated. So you want a model that keeps evolving, right? That keeps changing. And so like that just to make it concrete, when we did the work with autism, right, with deploying with kids, there could be a model. Often we'll have a model that helps us do the basic thing, like a model of engagement. Like, what does it mean for the kid who is using this to be engaged? But then we immediately have to keep adapting that model because it may not be right for that particular kid. And then in the same time, there's another model that's modeling specifically the child using the learning system that they were doing. They were, learning this numbers game. And that has to keep evolving because by definition, if the child is learning, they are changing. And so you really have two things. One is the system is evolving over time, as you said, but also two, multiple systems are evolving. This idea that there's a single system that knows everything, we're so far from being able to do that, right? So there are really multiple things going on, right? There's a model of engagement, and that's evolving. And then there's the model of the kid's ability to do math problems, and that's evolving. And then maybe there's another model about their social skill for eye gaze. And I think what people are not doing is thinking about that. So they're often trying to munge it all together into one black box model. And how well has that worked? Mm-hmm. So I think, but the more people collect more multimodal data over longer periods of time in real interactions, I think the more of that will get teased out. So I just want more people to work on real problems. That's my dream.
All right. Well, maybe we'll leave it at this. It was very.
It's too difficult. So
Yeah, well, what you only live once. Do something important.
oh, for sure.
Well, thank you very much. Another clap here, and
Thank you.
I'm gonna hand over to Ashed now.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much for the talk, Maya. Just a couple of questions for our speakers, more of an open-ended discussion. So feel free to unmute yourself. Yeah, but definitely a lot more questions. But if we just wanted to have a some kind of a goal that's maybe like a longer term goal, kind of an optimistic forward-looking goal, maybe 5 to 10 years from now for assistive technologies and AI, where do you see us going as a as a direction? So what do you think needs to happen or should happen, or kind of like you dream of happening in 5 to 10 years? And the way we do this is anybody anybody can go. So yeah, so go ahead.
Who wants to go? I don't want to go first. I'm always like jumping. I don't need to go first. I'll go first this time, but then next time someone else has to go first. There you go. So yeah, I'm actually very optimistic that we are, we are capable of building bigger models that are multimodal. There's a whole push for multimodal interaction. I do think there's some really interesting enabling going on around these generative large language models, but I'm not 100% Pollyannish about them. So that's difficult because they contain all of human biases in them as well, and that's not a good thing. But I'm optimistic that a lot of things are coming online, and we have so much of an interesting generation of young people. So that my biggest concern is to get young people to work on important things. I think we have a large generation of young people who went into computing because there are jobs. And I would just love to see some significant portion of those people working on things that matter, because I'm not convinced that otherwise that'll happen. Like, I want them to think about it. Like, why are you working on this? Not just because it's a job. Like, why are you have a choice, choose wisely. So that to me is, I know that's like a meta point, but I think a lot of technologies are coming about that could be enabling or not, right? So make them enabling, care about these things. Because it really is very empowering. There's so much potential. I don't want young people to feel like, oh, what could I do? You could do a lot. All right, I'll stop there.
Great.
I guess I can speak a bit to that. So I went over this in my talk as well, but I'm very excited about these large models, the ever increasing capability of AI to understand us as humans, understand our environments, and then figure out what are the natural experiences and how do you make them scale to everything. So I think going from very specific solutions to more general solutions for every part of life, for every combination of user requirement, because whether it is that you don't see, you don't hear, you understand differently, or on and on and on. I think generalizing to every type of human, and that might be reinforcement learning, it might be humans teaching the AI what they need rather than this one size fits all that sometimes we have. So yeah, I could talk so much more about that, but that would be the tip of the iceberg of my vision.
Mm-hmm. If I were to ask, what are some challenges on the way to realizing these kind of longer term goals? Maybe something that stands out to you from your work or from your product today. What do you think? What would you say those are some key challenges to bringing AI innovations to accessibility today?
Should I go first again?
Maybe that is a good sequence. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think enough people care. So I think, for example, I was really happy to hear about the work at Microsoft, and I had heard about it before, so it's wonderful. But I don't think that that's something that a lot of companies care about and that they're investing in. And it's, it's this just kind of general human, I don't want to say rude things, but yeah, people don't tend to care enough about true inclusion and diversity as they should. Though I am weirdly optimistic about this now, because I think somehow society now is surfacing more diversity and being more aware of it. And so I am actually hopeful that will change. I'm taking an optimistic view, but I think that's the reason historically why not. But I'm not an expert.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I don't know if anyone should be considered as an expert in some way. Shakib, is there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. How do you get people to care? And then how do you get people to be aware? So I'm very conscious that when I think about inclusion, I'm thinking about a very, including specific groups, and that's inclusion in terms of who we're designing for and the data that we have people about. So if you think about people who don't have internet access, who, the way we get data about people is over the internet. But what if you're not very much connected over the internet? I think about how do you include, I don't know, not to be cliche, but let's say, think about villages in Africa where they are connected, they have cell phone access, they have maybe in like one store in the town which is selling the mobile phones. It's just a very different world. I'm not picking that one particular corner, but there's so many corners of the world. And how do you make sure that you're including everyone, whether that is being representative of the types of data, whether the data we use is representative of everyone, but also that, even if you do care, how do you include enough different people that may be on your team who all care about different audiences so that you cover everyone in the world? And yeah, everyone in the world, it's a lot of people, a lot of aspects of humanity. So no easy answers.
Actually, you kind of touched on that. On my next question, Sakib. So I was going to ask if there are less explored use cases or problems that you think may benefit from more attention. It could be both from AI researchers and engineers or accessibility designers. Is there anything that comes to mind? So this can be either a problem that maybe is less explored, or maybe even a use case or a certain everyday task that might not receive as much attention today, and you think could benefit from more attention by researchers and developers and practitioners?
I think the most important problem for any individual is the problem you're having right now. So I think to our previous speaker's point, talk to the people, understand what are individuals' needs, because I'm optimistic about in the long term AI and technology which understands the human in a more general sense. But for today, we do need these very focused solutions, focused for very specific things. And you're only going to get that by speaking to people and understanding what are your lived experiences and challenges today. So you know, if I think about blind people and seeing AI, we hear, you know, oh, appliances and touchscreens that don't talk. You know, how are we going to? I actually this morning I wanted a glass of water, and I was stumped by a touchscreen water dispenser. I'm like, seriously, why do you need a touchscreen on a water dispenser? I eventually found a tap, you know, old-fashioned tap, but you know, that's just the problem I had right now. And I think the challenge is it's too specific. It's a very specific problem for one specific audience. And so I think you find someone and find their specific problems, but then that will generalize, I think, as well.
Okay, can I jump in and just agree with that wholeheartedly? And also just, I almost think now that you said it, I think we should just have AI systems that remind us. Like, for example, I'm often having to remind people that I'm writing papers with when they use like red and green. And I'm like, okay, come on, color blindness is really prevalent. Don't, of all colors you can choose for your plots, do not choose red and green. It's just so obvious, right? And then, you know, when we know that, for example, dyslexia affects 20% of the US population. Did you know that? I mean, why don't we remember that when we're designing things? It's not that hard to keep it in mind, but apparently it is hard. And so maybe what we need is like these constant reminders that are sort of like, okay, now you did that, but that's completely unfriendly to like 45% of likely audiences, right? I mean, I know, of course, that would get naggy, but it's things like that that people just don't realize, right? You design your website and you don't think about it. And I was recently in a training session required about something about choosing colors, whatever. And I thought, oh my goodness, this entire training session was done with no cultural context. Like, oh, these colors are good for this. I'm like, who says that? So I think there's just this kind of sense of being aware. And I don't know why people don't have it, but they don't. So how can we help them be more aware?
That's a big question. If I had to tackle that, I think it is partly that disability is uncomfortable to a lot of people. It's easier not to think about it. It's, you know, like,
right,
something you hope never happens. We're all going to get old, and we're all going to need different solutions, but it's uncomfortable to think about. So maybe inclusion rather than disability is the way to try and speak about this and get the next generation thinking about solutions, maybe.
I really like that, because I think you're exactly right. Because we're wired to, you know, dislike any difference. You know, it's physiological almost. Well, it is physiological, and that's very unfortunate, right? So people avoid it. They look away, both metaphorically and literally. Yeah, you're right. So but inclusion is, and this is why I'm optimistic, because I think the younger generation does understand this implicitly. And some of it also has to do, I think, with the fact that many of them are suffering in many ways, you know, with anxiety and so on. They're feeling pain, possibly on a larger scale, and this makes them more sensitive. I don't want them to feel pain, but if it makes them more inclusive, that's one silver lining, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think the generation that's growing up on the internet, I think, gets inclusion inherently because online they're interacting with, you know, their sphere of people they interact with is way broader than, say, previous generation whose friends and interactions were more local. So yeah, optimism.
Absolutely, optimism. We must have optimism. I mean, what else is left? Agreed.
I like it. I guess you mentioned, you know, getting outside of the lab and trying things in the real world. You definitely have to be optimistic when you're kind of like at the face of uncertainty of the real world, and you know, kind of it's messier, but then think, you know, maybe there's actual impact. Yeah, that's great. That is all the questions I have, unless we want to any kind of a discussion or any other notes you'd like to add. I think, yeah.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure is all ours. Thank you so much for being part of this event. So definitely want to thank you for your time and for your engagement. And I think with that, we can conclude. I wish everybody a great weekend. Thank you for joining us all across the world, different time zones. And hope we meet again soon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.